So this is a narrated PowerPoint on the Fukushima disaster, and this was a 9.0 magnitude earthquake and a 100-foot high tsunami that pummeled Japan's northeastern shoreline back in 2011. Over 18,500 people were killed and 465,000 people were displaced. To put that in perspective, that is about the same amount of people that live in Vermont today. So if you can imagine the whole population of Vermont being homeless or removed from their homes because of this disaster, that's what it was like. I have a video clip here, and this will show you the destructive force of a tsunami. This was actual footage taken from Japan back in 2011.
Taka, there were 24,000 people here, and look at the way every house is just being washed away. And look at the building in the front and see what happens as this wave of water, which in some places was up to 10 meters high, hits the building.
And we have no sense as yet as to the number of people who may or may not have still been in this particular town. Let's go to the second images here.
This is Miyako Port.
Now, what strikes you looking at these images? That the waves do not seem very high, but it is the force.
The water is shallow, but it is the force of it, as it being driven by the power of this huge volume of water behind it, surging towards the coast, that causes this massive destruction. Now, what?
As you can see, like they were saying, all that debris just gets picked up and moved and displaced from the coast inland, and this went on for miles, as there was so much force that there wasn't really anything that was going to stop it from continuing. And while that seems very destructive, what made Fukushima even worse of a situation was the nuclear power plant that was damaged because it was right on the coast by those waves, and it caused a massive amount of radiation to be leaked into the ocean, to the point where the levels of radiation were 4,000 times the legal limit. And there really wasn't anything anyone could do for months. The engineers worked tirelessly but could not really stop it, and so there was a lot that was released into the environment. And I have another video here that shows footage of that power plant being hit by waves.
This is the moment Japan's nuclear disaster began. A giant tsunami wave crashes into the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, seriously damaging the building's reactors.
So as you can see, even though the video is not great, you can see how close this facility is to the ocean. So if there were any form of leakage of radiation, it would go directly into the water. And while that doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, over the course of 10 days, that radiation between weather and ocean currents was carried. That fallout was carried to the west coast of the United States, and so this diagram kind of shows to what degree that this was a global incident and not just isolated to Japan. I'm sorry about that. And it just shows that we here in America, I mean, as far inland as Colorado, was affected by this, and the economies are also affected. I mean, the immediate damage was between $100 and $235 billion. And to put that in perspective, Hurricane Katrina cost the United States $125 billion. So some estimates say that this disaster was twice as expensive. Japan has the third largest economy, and this part of the country that was hit was about 6 to 8% of that economy, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it really is. And it caused the shutdown of major ports, limiting trade with the United States and other countries, and eventually, because of that trade, the U.S. dollar lost its value. So it was a very global thing that happened, and it caused international ripples to happen. They also had a massive amount of energy loss. 11 of the 50 nuclear reactors were closed down, and only 2 of those were reopened. And the capacity to produce electricity was reduced by as much as 40%. So that meant that they had to find ways, either buying energy or buying forms of machinery that can make energy, to fill the need that was now made for their people. Otherwise, people were going to go without energy. The biggest health risks, though, were from that radiation. And in a study done in 2012, 200,000 children near the Fukushima plant, out of that 200,000, about 56% of those children under 18 had precancerous lesions, which in normal circumstances would be almost zero. So you can see just in those numbers how detrimental this was to the overall health of their youth. They've also found 59 kids that had thyroid cancer, which is a condition that is extremely rare in children. And on top of the pregnancy risks of women that were exposed, psychological effects, and skin contamination, you can see that just in that area alone, there were significant health risks. There's also health risks involved when you have large amounts of people that are in like shelters. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, and that meant that they had to crowd all in one place. And when that happens, and when you figure the water probably compromised the sewage treatments and the sewers and wastewater treatment facilities and exposed all of those pathogens to people, there was a very good chance that water was contaminated. There wasn't a lot of drinking water to have. Again, with the energy crisis, there wasn't a lot of electricity, probably not running water. So these people were exposed to the elements, and Japan's also very cold that time of year. So you have to imagine that they were exposed to negative degree temperatures, very limited resources, food supply that was not constant, and dirty water. So a lot of the people were very likely to get diseases that are normally avoidable with all the amenities. And then diseases like the flu and influenza and pneumonia probably spread pretty rampant because people didn't have typical health care. Then there's the environmental effects, the more obvious. Earthquakes can cause ruptures in the landscape, but the biggest effects come from tsunamis, and the more immediate effects anyway. And they uproot trees with all the force like you saw in those videos. And what happens is when those trees are pulled up, that soil's exposed. And normally when it's held together in a root ball, when those roots are gone, that soil gets washed away. So whole fields and hillsides are probably washed out, causing even more damage and washing things back into the ocean that really shouldn't be there, including hazardous materials. And animals are killed by drowning. Natural resources are compromised, as well as even sea life. Like with those hazardous materials I mentioned, when those get washed back in the ocean, those animals get exposed to those chemicals, and it can cause them to die off. So it's very dangerous. And there's also the man-made effects. I mean, as you can see in the background, that's all debris. And like you saw in some of those videos, that debris gets picked up and washed out all over the countryside. That could get dumped on a farm field somewhere. And you can imagine that can cause some significant damage. Toxic substances and hazardous materials that would normally be confined are now out in the open. And the other thing too is rapid cleanup. If people are trying to, hurry through that job of trying to get back to normal, they might do inappropriate things like air burning and open dumping, which can lead to secondary impacts and more pollution, and ultimately a bigger issue. The aftermath, we're about 3 years after that, but everything's really moving slowly. A city that's about 38 miles inland from the coast, which is about the same distance from Burlington to Bristol. Children still fear to go outside, and they play inside, and they've been inside most of their lives. So, as you can imagine, like 3 years later, they're still fearing to move around. There's still whole cities and towns that are abandoned. And because so many people have gone missing, every 11th day of every month, there's searches that go on. And scientists believe that 4 decades is how long it's going to take for things to go back to normal. but it could take even longer than that.